I want to highlight just how important the US-EU relationship is for CSI members, and to add that we as CSI greatly appreciate our excellent working relationship with the EU delegation here in Washington, as well as the Commission in Brussels. We may have some differences of opinion on certain aspects of trade policy, but there's no question that we think stable cross-Atlantic ties should be a top priority. And that said, we're delighted to welcome Ms. Bajada, who has over 23 years of experience in EU affairs and 20 years in foreign policy. Prior to her current post, she was Deputy Director, Head of Division for the United States and Canada in the European External Action Service, EEAS. She has also served as the political advisor to the EEAS Secretary General, and in earlier roles, she's been posted in both Chile and Lebanon. Ms. Bajada joined the European institutions in 2002 and has also worked at the European Parliament and the Secretariat General of the Council of Ministers. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Ruth Bajada. Well, thank you for joining us here today. I know members are excited to hear from you. We always enjoy speaking with you and learning from you and hearing you share your thoughts. So to start things off, I'd like to ask if you could describe some aspects of trade policy in which the US and EU are still aligned, where we're connected, where we have common interests.
First of all, thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope that this is as fruitful to you as it is for me. I think you mentioned disagreements on trade. Maybe it's not only on trade these days, on other issues, but we always try to find ways of how to make and have ensure that this partnership is one of the strongest partnerships that we have, beyond the noise and whatever both sides do to trade. Trade between the EU and the US increased over the last year, which is a good sign. Europeans want American goods and services, and Americans want European goods and services. And I think from our perspective, this is something that, and I would say all the member states collectively, is something that we cherish and we want to build on. I think there are a number of areas that we want to work on. I'm not an expert on the moratorium and on the discussions on the WTO, and I think we're quite sorry that we couldn't get it through last week. But certainly, for instance, that was one area where we joined up forces with the United States, and we hope that we continue to do that. You've seen us last week. Commissioner Šefčovič was here. We signed an agreement on critical minerals. That's certainly one area where we see and that we can build on the work with the United States. Another big area that is also in the joint statement is semiconductors, and that's certainly also one area where we would like to work together with the United States to protect the supply chains. And I would say lastly, and certainly also with the big visit that President Trump will undertake in a couple of days towards China, for us addressing non-market policies and practices is also a priority for us, and we hear more and more also across the administration that this is also a priority for the US. We would rather do this collectively together with the United States within the G7. So I think under those premises there could be a lot of areas where we could work together.
Now I'll take us to some trickier topics. The Trump administration has steered a uniquely unilateral course in foreign policy and has been quite critical of the EU, both in terms of security policy and also because of the US trade deficit in goods. And these developments have sort of given further fodder and momentum to the EU to push to chart its own course. So I'll ask a few questions about the implications of this shift. First, on the trade front of the EU, the EU recently managed to conclude a series of trade deals with major partners, including among them Mercosur and India. Can you talk about the impetus of concluding these deals, any of which have been under negotiation for years?
I think my colleague Nuno sitting here would be reporting me to DigiTrade if I didn't say something, because you mentioned on the US trade deficit in goods. I have to mention that we have a deficit in services with the United States, and that it's always forgotten, which brings the relationship in almost equal footing. So I just want to mark that. Look, you mentioned earlier that I was posted in Chile, and I was in Chile when we were negotiating the upgrade of the trade agreement that we had in Chile, and we were again over the last 25 years have been negotiating with Mercosur. I think both the Mercosur and the India agreement should be seen also within a geopolitical context. What we have learned certainly from Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is that we don't necessarily, we have friends around the world, and we have allies and partners, but we don't necessarily have that many. So we need to cherish those we have, and we need to make sure that we bring them along with us. And I think it's also within that perspective that the agreements with Mercosur and with, in particular, also the one with India came through. Again, these are huge markets for us. We consider, of course, the Mercosur countries to be very much like-minded. There's lots of European investments there, and any work to do to reduce tariffs is something that we would have been looking at and achieving. My notes say that that the agreement on Mercosur basically estimate a 39% increase in annual exports to Mercosur countries, which amount to 49 billion. Of course, in the context that we have also tariffs with the United States, our businesses have to look for other markets, and it's with that perspective also that we have also negotiated both with Mercosur and with India. And it's in that similar perspective. It opens opportunities for businesses. It opens opportunity for small and medium-sized enterprises. It opens opportunity for procurement. So that's where it comes from. And I think it's been over the last 2-3 years, I think we've seen a reinvigoration. DigiTrade has been negotiating a number of these agreements, again, I think the war, Russia's war to Ukraine, the partnership between China and Russia has also made us realize that we need to have more stable agreements and more areas where we can allow for growth also for our businesses.
As another manifestation of the EU charting its own course, we've seen growing political interest in granting preferences to EU goods and services. And President von der Leyen has talked about, you just mentioned, procurement in the context of trade deals. President von der Leyen has talked about creating Made in Europe criteria in public procurement. And relatedly, the concept of digital sovereignty has been steadily gaining currency in the EU. CSI members are concerned about how this bodes for US market access. Could you share your perspective on how the Commission weighs this push against the longstanding EU principle of maintaining open markets?
I think the EU will always respect international obligations that it has. We will continue to negotiate free trade agreements. Again, also with President Trump, we took the position that we should negotiate and have an agreement that brings stability to our relationship. And again, also when it comes to this, what's referred to as the Made in Europe, it will be considered and it will be made operational within the international obligations and bilateral and plurilateral agreements that we have. So whatever we have negotiated with the United States in terms of GPA will be respected. We have a number of areas that are negotiated there, and we will honor those areas with the United States. It's not shouldn't come as a surprise that for us having control over critical infrastructure, data, and technologies is essential in today's world. But we don't see that we have to do them in terms of confrontation with our allies and partners, and we will always try to find ways how to have conversations about this.
The USTR has asked the EU to join a dialogue about tech regulations related to the August joint statement commitment on digital trade barriers. So far, the two sides haven't been able to reach agreement on what to cover in a discussion. Can you share the EU's perspective on this?
Sure. I think from our perspective, of course, we see the developments in AI. We see how this will impact our societies. We certainly feel the need to have conversations with countries, like-minded countries, like the United States on this. So I think there will be a lot of readiness from our side to engage with in this dialogue. It's something that we have agreed to. We, however, do not see this dialogue as a means to change or to put in question our sovereignty when it comes to tech regulation. Neither it is about enforcement or DMA, DSA for us. There is no yet agreement with the United States, but certainly also as Commissioner Šefčovič said during his visit, there's a commitment to do this and an openness to look into this and see how we take it forward. In fact, actually, I thought I would give you a scoop because Commissioner Šefčovič is in Paris, supposedly meeting USTR Greer. I was told possibly now, but I don't have any readouts of that yet. But we'll see. We'll hear during the day. Also it's in that sense, I want to reassure that there is constant and flowing conversations between our side and the US side.
Could you update us on where we are in the approval process for implementing the Turnberry Agreement, the terms of which were outlined in the bilateral EU-US trade framework issued last August?
So you've all seen the truth of last Friday. So I think President Trump thinks this is going a bit of a slow process. But on our side, Commissioner Šefčovič was here last week. He had meetings with Secretary Rubio, Bessent, Lutnick, and USTR Greer precisely on this. The United States is very well informed of our process. Ambassador Putzer, who is currently the US ambassador in Brussels, is a frequent traveler to Strasbourg and meets many of the parliamentarians. The European Parliament has voted for the deal, but has made some changes to the deals. They have it's not changes to the deal itself, so it's not the negotiations in the detail, but they've made a series of amendments, in particular when it comes to sunset clauses, and it has and these need to be negotiated now in what we call trialogues between the Commission, the Member States, and the European Parliament. I can't tell you how these negotiations are going because they're still ongoing, but from our perspective, we're looking at a resolution and the passage of the implementation of this agreement.
Getting the 5-minute warning, so I'll ask you a really easy question on tariffs. We heard a lot about tariffs from our congressional panel earlier today. As you are undoubtedly aware, the U.S. is now imposing tariffs on key sectors of the EU economy under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1964, and the USTR recently announced Section 301 investigations against the EU on the use of forced labor and overcapacity. And then Washington has raised the prospect of additional Section 301 investigations and potentially other trade remedies against the EU. As we all know, the EU has its own potential means to retaliate through the anti-coercion instrument. In what kind of scenario would the EU potentially be likely to invoke the ACI?
I think before we speak to the on the ACI, let's see. I mean, next week, I understand we're going to have a dialogue on the 301 investigations. I let him not, so that's correct. Certainly, we did not like what we saw published, and we don't like to see the European Union listed a long list of countries or sitting, next to China on forced labor. But we are ready to have conversations and discuss this. For us, the line has always been a deal is a deal. Yes, our process has been long and we had to go through the parliament. Some things happened along the way. Let's not forget Greenland and other issues. So, that's our reality, and it's, all our parliamentarians and governments have constituencies. That's what it is. But for us, a deal is a deal. On our side, we are committed to implement, and we are, looking towards and seeing that it will be the same on the side of the United States. We are worried, of course, when we see new investigations or sort of coming up, or certain phrasing of how certain phrasing is done. Also in the publishing of these of the 301 investigations. So we'll be looking at details. But for us, a deal is a deal. From what we have seen and heard until now, it is the same on the US side. So let's see. And then when it comes to the ACI, look, this will be done on a case-by-case basis. We have, as I said, constant contacts with this administration. We'll have the formal process. Let's go through that and discuss. Hopefully we don't have to discuss at a later stage. So I think our businesses have been very clear. You hear also heads of state and government. We have opted in Turnberry for stability. This is still the agreement of the 27 member states, and this is in that spirit, that's what Commissioner Šefčovič, how he negotiates and enters into these discussions. But let's see what comes from the other side.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you joining us today. It's always very helpful to hear you share the EU's perspective on these issues. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.